Now let's turn our attention to the intervertebral foramen. We said that what's passing through each intervertebral foramen is a spinal nerve. We have the spinal nerve drawn in at one level here, but of course remember there's another spinal nerve here, there's another spinal nerve there. Passing through each foramen is one spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is given the same number as the vertebra above the foramen when we're at thoracic, lumbar, or sacral levels, and it's given the name and number of the vertebra below the foramen when we're at cervical levels. So if this, for example, is a lumbar level, which it is, and if we were to say that this is, let's say, L2, and this is L3, and this is L4, then this spinal nerve coming out through the foramen between L3 and L4 would be the L3 spinal nerve. Now, that spinal nerve is in a fairly confined space when it's in the intervertebral foramen, and so anything that would impinge on that space could affect the spinal nerve. So what we need to do, therefore, is take a look at what's forming the boundary of that intervertebral foramen, because it's the structures of that boundary that could create the problems for the spinal nerve. When we look at the anterior boundary of the foramen, we see that that anterior wall of the foramen is made up, a lot of it is made up of the vertebral body of the vertebra above the foramen. Just a little bit of it here is made up of the body below the foramen. And a fair amount of that anterior wall is made up of the intervertebral disc. Now that's an important relationship, that the intervertebral disc is forming part of the anterior boundary of the intervertebral foramen. The reason that's important is that sometimes intervertebral discs can herniate. Now, let's get a little bit more specific about that, because herniation of the disc is not really the correct nomenclature. The correct nomenclature is herniation of the nucleus pulposus of the disc. So when we look at the intervertebral disc on the picture on the left, we see that the disc has two portions. An outer portion, called the annulus fibrosus. Annulus means ring, so this is made up of rings of fibrocartilage and fibrous connective tissue, annulus fibrosus. And this inner portion is called the nucleus pulposus. Pulpy, it's sort of a semi-gelatinous material, nucleus pulposus. We've already made comment in our early discussion that the nucleus pulposus is the only adult derivative of the notochord. We also know that mesoderm is what gives rise to connective tissue and cartilage and bone, and therefore the annulus fibrosus comes from mesoderm, the nucleus pulposus comes from notochord. We notice that the nucleus pulposus is not right in the center of the disc, but rather is displaced somewhat posteriorly. This is the posterior side here, this is the anterior side. So the nucleus is displaced somewhat posteriorly, that is to say, that the annulus fibrosus is thinner posteriorly than it is anteriorly. So that would mean that if the nucleus pulposus were to tear through or herniate through the annulus, we would expect that that would happen posteriorly, since the annulus is thinner posteriorly. And in fact, the herniation is almost always in a posteriorward direction, but not straight posterior. Because even though the disc is thin, the annulus is thin posteriorly, in the posterior midline, the disc is covered, or the annulus is covered over by a ligament. We can see that ligament in this view here that runs down the length of the column, going from body to body, passing over the disc as it goes. And as it passes over the posterior midline of the disc, it's reinforcing that disc. So that means that this disc is reinforced, even though this posterior annulus is thin, it's reinforced in the midline. But it's not reinforced to the right and left of the midline. So the right and left posterolateral surfaces of the disc are in fact the weakest portions of the disc. And so, as we'd expect, almost all herniations of the nucleus pulposus occur in a posterolateral direction, either posterolateral left or posterolateral right, or both, but rarely does it herniate straight posteriorly. The significance of that is that when we exit the annulus posterolaterally, that brings us into a position posterolateral to the disc, which means into the intervertebral foramen. So the nucleus pulposus that's herniating posterolaterally out of the disc is herniating into the space here, which is the intervertebral foramen. So it's now occupying space in the intervertebral foramen. Well, depending upon how much space of the intervertebral foramen it occupies, it may or may not cause compression of that spinal nerve. If it's a small herniation and occupies relatively little space, then there's going to be enough room for both that herniation of the nucleus and the spinal nerve to coexist without any problems. But if the herniation is larger and occupies more space, it will displace the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve can only go so far before it comes up against the bony wall of the foramen, and then it gets compressed against the wall. And it's the compression of the spinal nerve that results in the symptomatology that we associate with herniated nucleus pulposus. In other words, the compression of the sensory fibers in the spinal nerve will result in sensory symptoms, either pain or paresthesia or numbness in the region of the body distributed to by those sensory fibers, in other words, that dermatomal region. And compression of the motor fibers will lead to weakness of the muscles innervated by that spinal nerve. So it's the spinal nerve compression that results in the symptoms, and it's the compression that may be caused by the herniation of the nucleus pulposus. If there's no compression of the nerve, it's an asymptomatic condition. When we look at this slide, we can see that the herniation of this disc, the disc between L4 and L5, when it's herniating, notice that it misses the L4 spinal nerve that's exiting through the foramen at that level, but it's compressing the L5 spinal nerve that's on its way down to emerge through the L5-S1 foramen. So we have the general rule that when a disc herniates, if it's a herniation that affects only one spinal nerve, the nerve that it affects is the nerve with the number of the vertebra below the disc. So since the vertebra below this disc is the L5 nerve, is the L5 vertebra, the nerve that is affected is the nerve that is named L5. Now coming back to the intervertebral foramen, we see that the posterior wall of the foramen is being formed by the articular processes of the vertebra above and below that foramen, the articular processes, and those two processes come together to form a joint, and that joint is a synovial joint given the name zygapophyseal joint. Now, as a synovial joint, the zygapophyseal joint is subject to pathologies associated with synovial joints, and in this case, most specifically osteoarthritis. That's the degenerative arthritis. And what characterizes the appearance of an osteoarthritic joint or articular surface is that you have abnormal bone resorption and abnormal bone deposition. Instead of having a nice smooth articular surface, you have an irregular surface with the development of osteophytes, or bone spurs. Well, that means that if we develop a bone spur, an osteophyte, emerging from the zygapophyseal joint, if that spur emerges in an anteriorward direction, it's in fact growing into the intervertebral foramen. And since we know that the spinal nerve is occupying the intervertebral foramen, we can see that we can get compression of the spinal nerve from an osteophyte, from an osteoarthritic zygapophyseal joint. So just as a herniated nucleus pulposus could compress a nerve and cause some symptoms, the osteophyte from the zygapophyseal joint can compress the nerve and cause exactly the same symptoms, because remember, the symptoms are associated with the compression of the nerve, not associated with what's causing the compression of the nerve. So we've been making reference to this spinal nerve, so it's now time for us to look at the spinal nerve. And here we can see a cross-section through a region of the spinal cord and the formation of a spinal nerve. Now, the first point to be made on this slide is that what we call the spinal nerve is only this short region right here, starting there and ending there. From where these two roots come together to where the two rami come apart, that's the spinal nerve, nothing else. So the spinal nerve is really quite short. It's usually about 1 centimeter in length. And it's that short section, that short 1 centimeter of length, that's actually occupying the intervertebral foramen. So that means that medial to this point, we're inside the vertebral canal, and then lateral to this point, we're outside the vertebral canal, and going from here to here is where we're going through the intervertebral foramen to get from inside to outside. So that's the spinal nerve. We said that the spinal nerve gets formed by 2 roots, and we can see them here, and let's talk about them one at a time. This root, the dorsal root, we all know the dorsal root contains sensory nerve fibers. So these are the sensory fibers in the dorsal root. Now, as we look along the length of the dorsal root, we see this enlargement on the dorsal root called the dorsal root ganglion. Now, the word ganglion simply means a collection of nerve cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So that tells us that within that bulge, we should expect to see nerve cell bodies, and we see a schematic representation of a cell body here. But it's important to notice that the word ganglion is a very general term. It simply means that there are cell bodies there. It doesn't say anything about what kind of cell bodies. It doesn't say anything about whether any synapses are occurring on those cell bodies. It simply means that there are cell bodies there. And as we go through our discussion of the body, we're going to encounter different ganglia in different places, and they're going to be different from one another. They're not all the same. The dorsal root ganglion is a sensory ganglion. The cell bodies found in it are sensory cell bodies of these sensory nerve fibers that are found in the dorsal root. And there are no synapses. There are never any synapses in any sensory ganglion. It is simply the place where the cell body lives. Okay? So that's the dorsal root and the dorsal root ganglion. The ventral root contains motor fibers, and we see that along the length of the ventral root there is no enlargement. There is no ganglion on the ventral root. So the question is, where do the cell bodies of these motor fibers live? And we can see on this diagram that they live here inside the spinal cord, in the gray matter of the spinal cord. When you have a group of cell bodies inside the central nervous system, such as inside the spinal cord, we don't call that a ganglion, we call that a nucleus. So this we would call the anterior horn nucleus. So for the motor fibers, the cell bodies live inside the central nervous system. For the sensory fibers, the cell bodies live outside the central nervous system in a ganglion. That difference is important for us to understand the different embryonic origins of those 2 kinds of nerve fibers. When we talked about the cells of the basic 3-layered embryo, and we talked about the upper layer called the ectoderm, we said part of the ectoderm becomes neural ectoderm, part of the ectoderm becomes neural crest ectoderm. When we looked at that chart, we saw that both neural ectoderm and neural crest ectoderm gave rise to nerve cells, among other things. And so when we have a nerve cell, we might ask the question, did that nerve cell come from neural ectoderm or did it come from neural crest? And the answer to that question is always based upon the location of the cell body of that neuron. If the cell body of the neuron is inside the central nervous system, it might be in the brain, it might be in the spinal cord, but if it's inside the central nervous system, then we know that that neuron came from neural ectoderm, because neural ectoderm is what gives rise to the central nervous system. If the cell body of the neuron is in the peripheral nervous system, that is to say in a ganglion, then we know that that neuron came from neural crest. So that will always be true. Neural crest gives rise to neurons whose cell bodies are outside the CNS. Neural ectoderm gives rise to neurons whose cell bodies are inside the CNS. As we follow the roots laterally, we see that they come together to form the spinal nerve. So the spinal nerve has both motor and sensory fibers in it. After that short 1 centimeter of length, this nerve divides into 2 branches. The word for branch is ramus. So we have a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. Now this diagram is showing both sensory and motor fibers entering the ventral ramus, and that's true. It would be equally true if it had shown that both sensory and motor fibers are entering the dorsal ramus, because that's also true. So we have both motor and sensory fibers going to the dorsal ramus, both motor and sensory fibers going to the ventral ramus. The reason we have two rami is that we want to get to different parts of the body. The dorsal ramus goes to the posterior part of the body. The ventral ramus goes to the lateral and ventral parts of the body. And of course, both dorsal and ventral parts of the body need motor and sensory innervation. So we have both kinds of nerve fibers entering both rami. Now, when you look at an actual division of a spinal nerve into two rami, you'll always notice that the ventral ramus is much larger than the dorsal ramus. The reason for that is that there are far fewer nerve fibers in the dorsal ramus because there are very few things that get innervated by the dorsal rami. The only things that dorsal rami innervate are the skin of the back, the deep muscles of the back, and also the zygapophyseal joints that we talked about a little earlier. Everything else in the body that receives innervation from spinal levels receives that innervation through ventral rami. So that means the entire lateral and anterior body wall of the thorax and abdomen. It means all of the limbs, upper limbs, lower limbs. All of that is getting its sensory and motor innervation in the way of ventral rami. So what we have been talking about in this discussion of the spinal nerve, without explicitly saying so, is we've been talking about the somatic nervous system.